Good evening. Welcome to the Orange County Historical Society. Thank you all for coming tonight. If you keep turning up in these size crowds, we're going to have to buy more chairs for the church. That's just I have no problem with that. But all right. And speaking of which, if you've got a chair that's empty that's near you somewhere, just raise your hand. Okay, there's a bunch of them around. There's some up here. Yeah. So there are still some chairs left. Please don't be shy about, walking in front of people and between the tables. Just push your way on in. We're all friendly. Nobody bites that I know of. So, we did not end up doing our annual dinner this year. Hopefully next year we will get back to doing that again. But we thought we'd at least throw a little end-of-school pizza party. So we hope our members enjoyed that. In case anybody missed it, I did want to point out we do have a table full of books in the back that are all free to our members. So if you're a member, the books are free to you. If you're a non-member, there will be a nominal charge for the books. And you can ask Daniel about that, who's manning the table. I want to give you a quick sneak peek of what I'm working on when I'm wearing my program chair hat for next season. Our September meeting, because we do take the summers off, our September meeting on the 12th will be Stephen O'Neill, the renowned archaeologist and anthropologist of Orange County, who will be our speaker in September for the season kickoff. We're going to be doing Authors Night again next year. We're going to have some authors here presenting a new book about, it's called Knott's Berry Tales, and it is not just about that particular ride at Knott's Berry Farm, it's also about the development of Knott's Berry Farm in the 1970s and how Marion Knott became one of the first major woman executives in Orange County, and about the art of Rolly Crump, who was very involved in Knott's Berry Farm, and a lot of other really interesting topics. I'm sure Eric Plunkett will be back with another tale of early California. Hunter Fuentes, who's been doing some great work down on Laguna Beach, is going to be talking about architects of historic Laguna Beach. Some of you may have seen where he did some bus tours recently that apparently were very well received. Also, I've got a Disney Imagineer and historian to be named coming to talk about Disneyland's first 15 years. We're going to be, I'm hoping to finish up a program of my own that'll be about one of the area's last notable Old West shootouts from 1888. And then we're also hoping to put together a history hike for Black Star Canyon. Yeah, that is the appropriate reaction. Very good. Yeah. So it is a pretty amazing place for a whole lot of reasons. Also, normally our year ends with the school year, but we've got one more event coming up because some of you know our celebration of Judge Pleasance was delayed, postponed due to rain. So it has been moved to July 27th, and it will be out there in Majeska Canyon. Those who signed up for the last time get first dibs on signing up this time. However, we should point out we have more space available this time. We found out how to get more people out there. And so even if you didn't get to sign up, hope is not lost. And you may want to go on our website and check that out and sign up. So I'm not sure what that tick, tick, tick is, but yeah. All right, and as for our election, because it is our June meeting, as you know from our newsletter, we call for nominations several months in advance, which we did, and based on the response we receive, if any we The nominating committee will then select a slate. And I'm glad to say that those on the slate are all longtime OCHS volunteers who have long since proven to be tremendous assets to the society. And as my kindergarten teacher would have said, they work and play well with others. If you are a member and you have not yet voted, you should have received a ballot at the door. If you've not, you can go over by the door and pick one up. And I think the ballot box, has that been moved yet over to the table here by Alan? Okay, we're going to move it over here by this table by Alan. We will round that up at the end of the meeting. I also wanted to just have our board members raise their hands, like stand up and just say who they are one at a time. So we all know who the board members are and we get a little quick introduction.
Bill Chen. Been on board now for 21 years.
Guy Ball has been around for maybe 9.
Yeah.
I'm Alan Ray, I'm treasurer.
Aida Cuevas was 2 years now? 2 years here. Stephanie George, I'm the secretary, and I've been on the board for 15 years.
Mike Kluwer, I'm a newbie. I've worked on the board for a couple of years.
Daniel Crutel, and I've been on the board for about 3 or 4 years.
Okay, I think that right. And I'm Chris Jepson, the current president, and I've been here for a long time. I wanted to take a second tonight to particularly thank Guy Ball. He's going to be rolling off our board to go do other great things. He's involved in all kinds of local history projects, including Tustin Area Historical Society and all of their projects and everything. He's been on our board for about 3 terms, 9 years. He's worked on events. He did our newsletter for a while. He's our membership guy. He's been keeping track of all of our membership records. And when you receive things in the mail, it's because he's keeping us organized. And when you're, he's the renewals and printing out the labels and keeping track of those for our mailings, sending out mass emails and keeping them organized. So it's like, okay, this is for everyone, that's just for members. Sifting all of that stuff and keeping track of it all, which is something I would be terrible at, but comes naturally to Guy. And he's also always been great about, if we put out a call and we need somebody to put together shelving or move furniture or haul boxes or assemble something, he's Johnny on the spot too. So we're going to miss you, but we thank you very much for all your years of service, and we hope we will keep seeing you around even if you're not on the board. So thank you guys. And speaking of toting and hauling and doing work like that, this might be a good time to mention we are, some of you have followed the trials and travails of our office/archives, where the building next to us burned down, and so we had to close down while they rebuilt the whole area. Then COVID closed us down, so we couldn't get in. Then the roof leaked, so there was mold, so they had to do remediation, and we had to move everything. And now we've got all of that squared away, and we think we're okay, but we need to move everything back where it belongs now. So, if you're willing to come down for a day, just spend a couple hours on a weekend day sometime in the next month or two. Sooner rather than later would be good. Either email me or give me a phone call or come up to me after the meeting and give me your contact info, and we'll bug you when we can make that happen. But it should be fairly soon, and it'll really be great to have our collections accessible and available, and people can come do research again, and I can stop telling people, yeah, you can't really come down and look for whatever it is you need to look for right now. So that will be a really nice turning point, and so we'd appreciate any volunteers. All right, with that, I would like to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Benjamin Jenkins. He has a master's in library science and received his PhD in history at the University of California, Riverside in 2016. He is associate professor of history and archivist at the University of Laverne, where he teaches U.S. and California history and directs the public history program. And I hear nothing but great things about him from the history folk out in Riverside. So with that, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to set my water up here, and we'll be good to go, I think. Let's see if I can make this work. Yes, I can. Okay. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, Chris. As Chris mentioned, I've been sort of up and down the Santa Ana watershed the last few weeks, starting off in Redlands, then to Riverside, Orange today. So, I don't know, catch me on the beach in just a few weeks, more or less. At any rate, I'm here to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, as I suspect it is to the hearts of many of the people in this room. And that is the connection between the citrus and railroad industries in Southern California. This is the topic that I've written a couple books about, most recently in my book, Octopus's Garden, How Railroads and Citrus Transformed Southern California, which was published by University Press of Kansas just last year. In this book, I essentially argue that these two industries sort of created Southern California as a distinct geographic, cultural, and economic unit from about 1870 to 1950. They really shaped public perceptions of how people thought about Southern California. They transformed the landscape to make it less pastoral and more industrial and agricultural. And they really shaped labor networks and depended very extensively on the various cultural groups that lived here, including the indigenous peoples, the Californios, who predated American settlements in the region, as well as later immigrants from places like China and Japan. Those are the major themes of this book, and those will be the ones that I'll be focusing on tonight because, alas, I cannot condense 350 pages into an hour or so talk. And if you're wondering, the Beatles reference will make sense in just a few minutes. So before I get too deep into the weeds here, I'd like to sort of define what I think of as Southern California. And I take my definition really from one of the most important scholars of the region. There was a gentleman back in the 1930s and 40s by the name of Kerry McWilliams. He actually was a major journalist who worked for a number of periodicals, including as an editor. He was on the front lines, for instance, of the citrus strikes in Orange County in 1935, 1936. So he sort of defined Southern California as radiating out from the hub of Los Angeles County to encompass a lot of regions that were best known for growing citrus, places like Riverside, Orange, even a little bit farther south into San Diego and Imperial, San Bernardino, the largest county in America. But for our purposes, I also like to include some regions a little bit west and north of Los Angeles as also being part of Southern California. And in particular, Ventura and Santa Barbara were pretty well known for their participation in the citrus industry. So for tonight, when I mention the phrase Southern California, this distinct geographic conception should be what you bring to mind. And now beginneth the history lesson. Citrus does not come to us from Southern California. I've actually met a lot of people who think, oh yeah, oranges have always grown in the region. Oranges originally come from Southeast Asia, in what we think of as Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, today. Slowly over time, European explorers found a number of citrus fruits that they liked in Southeast Asia and brought them back to Europe. And in particular, Portugal and Spain, the two first world empires back in the 15th and 16th centuries, experimented with bringing different varieties of oranges from Asia to some of the colonies that they had settled in the New World. For instance, the Portuguese explorers who established Brazil brought a number of citrus fruits there. Put a thumbtack in what seems like a piece of trivial information because we'll come back to that later. Spaniards started growing oranges in what we call Mexico today, or what they thought of as New Spain, as early as the 16th century, the 1520s. A gentleman by the name of Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was a soldier in the army of Hernan Cortez that conquered Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, in 1520 or so, mentioned how he brought orange pips and sowed them across Mexico because the sort of more humid southern climate of southern Mexico was amenable to that. But for our purposes, what's important is that oranges really come to us from Spanish-speaking Franciscan missionaries of the Roman Catholic Church in the 18th century. As you all no doubt know, if you've gone into California public schools and had to build a mission like so many of my classmates and I had to do, then you know that the Franciscan mission of the Roman Catholic Church started in San Diego in 1769, eventually established a chain of 21 missions up the coast of what the Spanish administrators of the region referred to as Alta California. And so it was priests, like the gentleman shown on the top side, men like La Suen or Junipero Serra, who introduced citrus agriculture to the region. Maybe it would be fair to say that they brought the plants, they brought the oranges, they brought the seedlings and the seeds and the saplings, because they didn't do the actual farming. As you know, no doubt, the folks who did the actual work at these missions were indigenous peoples who, there's no polite way to say this, were essentially press-ganged into doing labor that they really wanted no part of. For the most part, these indigenous folks had no history of farming, were not familiar with agriculture, and so it was an entirely new, strange way of life for them. Nonetheless, they persevered. They established orange groves at some of the early missions, most notably at San Gabriel up in Los Angeles County, San Fernando, as well as Mission San Diego, which was the first mission, the mother mission, if you will, at least in the early years. This sort of set a pattern that would be expanded significantly by the late 19th century, that white landowners would be the ones who made all the money off of oranges, reaped the benefits of growing them, but it was primarily workers of color who did the actual planting, digging of ditches, irrigating, harvesting, and later packing when we start to ship oranges internationally. Most of the oranges that were produced at missions like San Diego or San Gabriel were consumed locally. They were eaten by people who lived in California, not shipped out to the rest of the Spanish Empire. And in fact, orange growing was not the dominant commercial activity in Spanish or in Mexican California. That was cattle ranching. And some of the first vaqueros, or cowboys, were actually indigenous Californians, native peoples like the Luiseños here in Orange County, or the Tongvas up in San Gabriel County, the Cahuillas. We can see in these images at the bottom here a couple of vaqueros. These gentlemen actually appear to be more California than indigenous, but still taking part in what was the dominant industry in California, which was raising cattle to sell for hide and tallow, with beef being a good secondary product coming out of it as well. After Spain got kicked out of California, and later on after Mexico got kicked out of California, cattle ranching was still the dominant commercial activity, at least in the southern part of the state, through the mid-1860s. Unfortunately, by that time, a series of droughts really wiped out the cattle industry, punctuated, pretty ironically, by a series of floods. I've read newspaper stories written by folks who were journalists in Los Angeles, talking about how they would go to the hills surrounding the city and just see carcasses, tens of thousands of cattle, entire herds decimated, which they refer to as harrowing in the extreme. So, as I said, cattle ranching is really the dominant form of commerce in California until about the 1860s, which benevolently happens to be the period in which the railroad came to town. Railroad is a technology that originates really in Wales and England. It was originally used in the collieries, that is the coal mines, to transport industrial goods back and forth across the British countryside. Americans got their hands on it by the late 1820s, early 1830s, and really made it their own. And by the end of the 19th century, even by the mid-19th century actually, the United States has more railroad lines than just about any other part of the country. The minute that the United States acquires New Mexico, California, and the rest of the so-called Mexican cession from Mexico, shortly after the Mexican-American War, Americans start dreaming about, what if we had a railroad that went all the way across the country, from sea to shining sea, that would allow us to ship our goods to the Pacific coast, where they could be set across the Pacific Ocean to Asia. So we could have customers in Japan, whom they've already sort of forced to buy American goods at gunpoint by the 1850s, and the Chinese. The Civil War sort of deflected this for a few years, but by 1869, the United States had completed what was known as the first transcontinental railroad. Went from Omaha, Nebraska to originally Sacramento and then later out to Oakland and San Francisco. Seems like kind of cheating, I think, to call something that only goes to Nebraska transcontinental. But from Nebraska, from Omaha, you could get on trains to points across the Midwest and in the eastern United States, even if you had to transfer trains, because the gauge or the space between tracks may not be exactly the same. Two corporations were responsible for building the Transcontinental Railroad. One of us, which is still here today, the one that's on the eastern side of the map, is the Union Pacific Railroad, built from Nebraska to about Promontory Point, Utah, by 1869. The more important one, at least for our story, is based in Sacramento and later San Francisco. It's referred to as the Central Pacific Railroad, or the CPRR, or CP. It was led by four capitalists who came during the gold rush to try to strike it rich, realized, there's not much gold to be had here, so we're going to make money as bankers, miners, merchants instead. These four gentlemen became known as the Big Four, and they became sort of the beating heart of California's railroad industry. I won't quiz you on this later, but if you're interested, their names are Hollis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Leland Stanford, or Steele and Lanford, as the press liked to call him at the time, and Charles Crocker. The Big Four originally wanted to build a transcontinental railroad, get rich off government contracts doing it, and then get out. Yeah, this guy laughs, and he's right to do so, because they got so deep into debt building this railroad, they had no idea how immensely difficult it would be. So they realized, well, we have to stay in the railroad business now. We have to recoup our costs by hopefully shipping different commercial goods. And for California, which until now you could only reach by steamship, clipper ship, or overland wagon, sounds like sort of a good thing, right? Instead of taking 6 months to cross the plains, you can now get from Nebraska to California in the matter of less than a week. And on the whole, that sounds like a good thing. But unfortunately, there were a number of challenges that the railroad introduced as well. The first was the fact that the Big Four were really the only game in town in the late 19th century. Until about the mid-1880s, if you wanted to use the railroad, your money was going directly into the pockets of these four gentlemen, which meant that they could jack up prices as high as they wanted to. Now, I said they had to stay in the railroad business to sort of recoup their costs, which they did, and then they became millionaires, or in one case at least, became a billionaire. And so as a result, they are able to amass these huge fortunes that they use to buy off politicians, corrupt judges, and just overall sort of take hold of California. By the late 1870s, one sort of recurring theme that we see in a lot of political cartoons, newspapers, and magazines was the idea that this railroad is this monstrous entity that's risen from the deep to sort of ensnare California in its tendrils. This is my favorite image, the idea of the railroad as an octopus. This was a cartoon that appeared in The Wasp, and it was penciled by the famous cartoonist George Keller, who's good for this, and also made a number of really racist Chinese caricatures, but we'll focus on this for now. If you look within the tentacles of this octopus, you'll see miners, international shippers, farmers, even the state legislature of California in its grasp. And if you look at the center of the octopus, in the eyes, you'll see Leland Stanford and Charles Crocker, two members of the Big Four. What's that, miss? You just noticed? Yeah, they're sort of like this spectral entity, sort of in the eyes of the octopus. I don't know if George Keller's ever seen an octopus before, because what does octo mean? 8. How many tentacles do you count on this guy? More than 8, at any rate. So clearly historical or natural history facts taking a back seat to the artistic story that Keller wanted to tell. So we now have our octopus. That explains half the title. But we don't have a garden yet. We'll get to the garden in just a minute. One of my favorite illustrations of the avarice of which the railroad was capable occurs in the form of the creation of the city of Colton. By the 1870s, Central Pacific had been sort of replaced among the Big Four by what was known as the Southern Pacific. That became their major transcontinental railroad. Still the same owners, just a more popular name. Southern Pacific Railroad originates up in the San Francisco area, goes through the Central Valley, out to Yuma before heading all the way to Louisiana. It was a second transcontinental route that the Big Four owned by the 1880s. And in the 1870s, Southern Pacific was coming through Southern California, and every town in the region is like, oh my gosh, we have to get a railroad station. We have to be on the map, because if we do, we'll be rich and prosperous, and if we don't, we will get left behind. So one of the cities that tried to get a railroad connection was San Bernardino. In the 1870s, it's really this tiny little settlement that is a former assistencia. It was sort of connected to Mission San Gabriel. After that, it was a Mormon settlement, and it really wants to take off as an agricultural center. And so members of San Bernardino actually meet with executives from the Southern Pacific Railroad, and they ask, hey, would you build the line through our town? Would you build a railway station here? And they're like, sure. Of course, they're asking for their palms to be greased. They are asking for a fee, which we would think of as a bribe today, but was simply the cost of doing business back in the 19th century. San Bernardinans say they're not good for a fee, and the railroad says that they're not good for a station through San Bernardino. They look a few miles west because they realize the San Bernardino area is still a good place to lay tracks, and so they build their own town called Colton, named after one of the executives who worked for the railroad, and Colton became one of the biggest railway hubs in Southern California. If you've ever driven through the San Bernardino Valley on Interstate 10, you can still see the enormous rail yards just south of the freeway, built by Southern Pacific, which have now been taken over by Union Pacific. Historians like to refer to this as a spite town that exists just so the railroad can thumb its nose at the city of San Bernardino, which will have revenge about 10 years later. So the citrus industry that I said was never really that large in Southern California really starts to take off in the 1870s in a variety of different hubs. One of those hubs is in San Bernardino County, actually, a little bit south of the city of the same name on the Santa Ana River, in a new colony that's referred to as Riverside. Riverside was established in about 1870. 3 years later, it was settled by a family known as the Tibbetses, Eliza and Luther Tibbets, who are just a really fascinating couple. They met in like a seance when she was trying to help him get in touch with his dead wife, fell in love. What's that?
That's how I date. I try to keep it separate.
I get it, yes, exactly. It's, it's a good way to find money. But it's not a good way to find a stable husband, because these two moved across the eastern United States. They started to try to open like racially integrated communes in Virginia right after the Civil War. Timing was not right there. They did not know their audience, and so they decided to eventually move west. And as Eliza, in particular, is moving west, she writes a letter to one of her friends at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and says, hey, I'm going to California. So yeah, and he says, hey, wait a minute. I just got these new trees. Why don't you take them out to California and see what kind of fruit they produce? These fruits were a type of orange that came from Brazil. And in particular, they came from around Bahia, which is a large city in Brazil today. And for whatever reason, after the Portuguese introduced oranges to Brazil, this particular variety started to mutate, to get rid of its seeds and actually have the embryo of a second tiny little fruit grow inside the skin of the orange, so that it sort of protrudes outward and looks like a belly button or a navel. And so originally this was referred to as the Bahia navel orange. Americans, of course, have to rename it and colonize it, so this gets renamed the Washington navel orange instead, because what's more patriotic than that? The Washington navel orange was planted in Riverside in about 1873. Supposedly, in the early years of the town, when the canals to the Santa Ana River were still being dug, Eliza would use dirty dishwater to try to nourish her trees. That's what we call gray water, and that is environmentally sustainable. So for all the flack that I gave Eliza a minute ago, she was ahead of her time in that area. But regardless of what we think about Eliza Tibbets, a lot of her neighbors decide these are the most delicious oranges we've ever had. We're going to swap out some of the varieties that we have and actually take grafts from her tree, take cuttings of branches with Washington navel oranges, maybe graft them onto rootstock that we already have in our orchards. And the Washington navel DNA will essentially overwrite the tree's DNA, and you will get navel oranges instead. These things started to win prizes in Southern California, in the Riverside area, in Pasadena, Los Angeles, eventually up in Sacramento Valley, which is a little bit more populated. And as a result, people start to look at Southern California as an ideal place in which to grow citrus fruits. So there's the Washington navel orange. There are a variety of lemons, such as the Eureka, which is actually developed in Los Angeles, the Lisbon lemon as well. The Valencia orange took off starting in the earliest date I've seen of Valencia orange plantings in Southern California is 1876 in Fullerton, although I would leave it to my colleagues from Orange County Historical Society to correct me if I'm incorrect about that date. Placentia, thank you. Ooh, somebody said, no, that's Fullerton. I'm not stepping into that one, folks. I'm a San Bernardino Valley resident. I'm not going to say anything about that. What's indisputable, though, is that 22 years after Eliza Tibbets planted her first oranges, this is what Riverside looked like. We could see Mount Rubidoux looming lovingly there in the background. All these trees are Washington navels, with like a few eucalyptus and a few other species maybe being used as windbreaks or to replenish the soil from when all the nutrients are being depleted. Please hold your laughter until I make an actual joke, whoever that was outside. Thank you. By 1895, Riverside is the wealthiest city per capita in the United States. That means, on average, your average Riversider is richer than your average Bostonian, or your average New Yorker, or Philadelphian. Mainly because we don't have huge street gangs of immigrants who get left behind by the dock service as soon as they're let out into the United States. But I digress. This citrus industry, which is no fault of their own, it's the fault of the government and society that is not going to allow them to integrate themselves. But what started at regional areas like Riverside or Fullerton Placentia District or the coastal area of Santa Paula, which is where lemons really started to take off, eventually incorporates entire new communities. San Gabriel Valley, where I come from, for instance, becomes, I don't want to show that yet, a huge citrus production center. This shows what San Gabriel Valley looked like by about 1900 or so. This actually comes from a railroad flyer. Railroad very much saying, hey, come to California, see the oranges, maybe buy some land. Who knows? You'll fall in love with it here. San Bernardino Valley, places like Upland, where I currently live, became a major orange producing center. And of course, the Valencia orange became the dominant crop in Orange County. Now, the citrus industry would not have thrived without the arrival of railroads. Remember that railroads came through Southern California in about 1876, just 3-ish years after Tibbets plants her first oranges, and the same year that the Placentia district starts to experiment with Valencias. This is actually one of the first railway stations that was in Los Angeles in the 1880s. This comes from a documentary history of LA that was published in about 1883 or so. This shows the property of William Wolfskill. Wolfskill was a Kentucky fur trapper who retired to California very late in his life in the 1840s, when it was still part of Mexico. By the end of his life, this was supposedly the largest orange grove in North America, even before the railroad came through town. So it really should come as no surprise that the Southern Pacific rolls into Southern California and decides to actually build a railway station on the Wolfskill property within sight of these orange groves, because they realize this is going to be a major sell for tourists, and we want to make sure that it's very easy for orange growers to ship their product over the railway. And in fact, by 1877, William Wolfskill's dead. His son, Luis, has taken over, or Louis if you prefer, and he shipped the first carload of California oranges on the railroad. And it cost him like $500 to do this, because he had to pay the railroad to periodically re-ice his goods so that they didn't spoil in transit. This was in the years before refrigerated railroad cars. But realizing that California was a huge producer of citrus by the 1870s and 1880s, the railroads here really did start to invest in ventilated cars that allowed air to come through quickly and easily, and then actual full-fledged refrigerator cars that had just huge chunks of ice to keep the oranges from spoiling in transit. These refrigerator cars were called reefers early on. There it is. That means something different today. But they also extended the market reach for produce grown in Southern California. Originally, oranges and lemons from here. Oh no, there's children in the audience. I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, well, he's laughing, so it's good. Anyways, the oranges and lemons grown in Southern California would have been distributed like to the Midwest in the 1870s and 1880s. But as icing technology improved, as entire ice facilities were constructed in places like Roseville up in the Central Valley or Los Angeles in San Bernardino, these cars could make it as far east as the East Coast. They could go to New York, Philadelphia, Boston. And from there, the railroad would even pay for them to be shipped to the European continent or even to England. Supposedly, a group of orange growers sent some of their produce to Queen Victoria in the 1890s, and she pronounced it palatable. There's that typical Tudor understatement for us. There we go. Well, by the 1880s, there's a couple developments that really transformed the railroad scene in Southern California and make it much more amenable to working closely with orange growers. And the biggest, most transformative event is the arrival of a second transcontinental railroad corporation that challenges the commercial dominance of the Southern Pacific. Back in the 1850s, a gentleman by the name of Cyrus Holliday of Kansas had a vision of replacing the old Santa Fe Trail, which connected the Midwest to New Mexico, with a railway, tapping into the commerce that linked Mexico to the United States. Civil War kind of shut down his efforts to build a railway, but over the intervening 10 years, by 1869, he decided, you know what, I'm not going to stop at Santa Fe. I'm going to go all the way to the Pacific coast. And so he establishes what he referred to as the Atchison, after the city where it started, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. Santa Fe all the way, baby. Over the 1860s and especially the 1870s, Santa Fe really battles its way across the American Southwest through places like Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. And by 1880 or so, it's right on the border of Southern California. The Big Four, those railroad monopolists who controlled the Southern Pacific, pulled out all the financial and legal stops that they could to try to keep Santa Fe out. But a number of communities in Southern California, including San Diego and San Bernardino, really worked closely with the Santa Fe Railroad system to, do they have a map? No, I must have gotten rid of the map. Darn it, that's a real pain. To build a competing line and to eventually establish a second transcontinental network. By 1885, Santa Fe Railroad has its own tracks into Los Angeles, the city of angels, and so as a result, people growing oranges and lemons in Southern California now have a choice of whether they want to ship via Santa Fe or Southern Pacific, the old Octopus. The way capitalism is supposed to work is that when you have competitors, that should lower prices for the consumer. And this is exactly what happened in the case of California. Southern Pacific and Santa Fe were consistently trying to undercut each other's prices. And at one point, for a single day in 1887, it was possible to get a railroad ticket from the Midwest out to Los Angeles for the low, low price of $1. That's much more money back in 1887 than it sounds like today, but it's still something that put the idea of moving to California well within reach of all Americans back in the 19th century. And move to California they did. There was a huge population and real estate boom that swept Southern California in the 1880s. We can see an excursion train. As you could take a close look here, you'll see that those are not freight cars, those are passenger cars, since freight doesn't need to have windows. I guess if you're transporting cattle and you want them to look out, right? But cattle growing in California is not as big a deal in the 1880s. This is actually from my hometown of Laverne, from what was called the city of Lordsburg back in the 1880s and 1890s. Entire new communities sprung up directly along the railroad tracks. In the 50 or so mile span that connected San Bernardino to Los Angeles, something like 30 towns came into being in 1887. And a lot of these towns eventually folded, but the people who came to live there stayed in Southern California, invested in the region, and many of them took part in the citrus industry. So by the 1880s, citrus is very much here to stay. And it becomes a driver of the economy by working very closely with the railroad system. This postcard comes to us from the State Library of California, particularly from their California History Room. And it shows us what many Californians would have enjoyed around the late 19th to early 20th centuries. Literally, there were entire rail lines that would go through different towns in rural Orange County or rural Los Angeles County, where people could just go through the orange groves and try to reach out of the train and grab fruit right off the tree. You shouldn't do that. People did do that. People got injured in the process, which is why you shouldn't do that. There was no OSHA, there was no Transportation Safety Administration back in 1900, so I suppose we can forgive them. But this is not a stylization. This is actually a photograph that was tinted by hand or hand colored. So literally a sight that Californians would have seen. So not only are orange growers getting rich by shipping their products over the railroad to different markets across the eastern US, but the railroad is turning these orange groves into a tourist attraction that people are able to make money off of, or that they're able to make money off of by getting settlers to come live here. Of course, the people who are doing the picking in the orange groves aren't necessarily getting rich doing this, but more on them in a minute. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, and by a minute I mean like half an hour ago, I've been talking much longer than I anticipated. Generally, the first citrus workers in Southern California were indigenous peoples, Native Americans. That was very much the case even in the late 19th century, as citrus is really taking off commercially. The city of Riverside gets so enamored of the idea of having a cheap source of Native American labor that that city actually pushes to establish a Native American boarding school where indigenous children can be brought in to essentially learn how to be good white English-speaking people, have their hair cut, have their names replaced by Anglo-Saxon sounding names. This is what was known as the Sherman Institute. It's still with us today, although its outlook is much more progressive, much more about Native American self-determination. But back 100 years ago, it was a way that a lot of the orange growers in Riverside thought that they could get a cheap source of labor by bringing a bunch of Native Americans to school and offering them jobs during the off-season or after school and on the weekends. The image on this slide, for instance, depicts a field trip of Native American students at a local sun-kissed packing house in Southern California. The exposure time for this must have been pretty long because they look like they're absolutely miserable, like they've been standing still for 45 or 50 seconds, the way you'd have to for old photos. Another really affordable labor force that California tapped into in the late 19th century was the huge Chinese population. Since the 1840s, since the gold rush, California has had an immense population of people from China, particularly from southern China, who gave up a lot of their life savings to try to travel across the Pacific Ocean into what they called Gumsanhak, or Gold Mountain. Like most people who came to California, the Chinese did not generally strike it rich, and so they had given up their life savings and found themselves stuck in the United States and had to do something for work. If only there was a large monopoly that needed a constant supply of workers for construction, maintaining tracks, and doing all sorts of things. The railroad instantly snapped up the Chinese population of California in the 1860s, pressing them into service, building the first transcontinental railroad. A lot of reports dating all the way back to the 1860s commented that, holy cow, these guys are much more efficient than our white crews. They don't go on strike, they don't ask for more food, they don't complain. They're more efficient in laying track during the day. They don't complain as much when they get blown up in dynamite explosions in the high Sierra Nevada mountains. And so the Chinese really did quite literally build the first transcontinental railroad. Not only that, but they also laid tracks to places like Los Angeles, Orange County, San Diego. Even after that first transcontinental was built, the railway system in the far west, and especially in California, would not have succeeded without Chinese labor. Neither would the citrus industry. In places like Orange County, as pasturage for cattle was very quickly being transformed into citrus groves, Chinese got jobs as orange pickers, orange packers. Because China has been practicing citrus agriculture for millennia, long before the Spanish Franciscans were doing it, long before Americans were doing it, Chinese farmers would even introduce new techniques, new varieties of oranges and lemons that took off in Southern California. In the top image on this slide, we can see Chinese railway workers at Promontory Point, Utah. That was where the first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869. And to their credit, the railroad actually took a photograph of the Chinese work crew. The railroad was, saying they were kind to the Chinese would be a stretch, but kinder to Chinese Americans than most of US society was at this point. Even the citrus industry was generally more tolerant and indulgent and cooperative with Chinese workers than the rest of American society. And in the bottom image, we can actually see packers in Santa Ana, here, just a short stone's throw from here, right, who are primarily picking and packing oranges. Unfortunately, there was a perception that wherever the Chinese went, they sort of lowered wages and took jobs away from white workers. And so the labor movement of California started to want to kick Chinese out of the Golden State. The Chinese must go was the official slogan of the California Working Man's Party, the major political force of unions in the 1870s and 1880s. Lynch mobs from places like Los Angeles all the way out to Redlands in the San Bernardino Valley went after Chinese workers in orange groves, lynching them, cutting off their hair, publicly humiliating and killing them. And perhaps the greatest indignity came in about 1883 when Congress passed what was known simply enough as the Chinese Exclusion Act, saying that no more Chinese immigrants can come into the US. And that lasted until about the 1940s, until World War II. Yeah, there's a gentleman going like this with his head, and I feel you, man. I really do. The railroads and citrus industry clearly reshaped sort of the labor landscape, tried to invigorate and bring minorities into the population of California. That's my first main argument here. My second main argument is that they really reshaped the landscape to fit their commercial needs, and in the process, they transformed the way Americans thought about California in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This railroad brochure, which was circulated around 1905 or so, California for the Settler, was actually published by the Southern Pacific Railroad, and you probably wouldn't know that to look at it unless you saw the actual name at the bottom there. What's looming overhead, but of course, delicious orange fruit, which is often used as sort of a stand-in for the sun, as if to say that these oranges are sun-kissed. More on that later. But we can see immense pastoral landscape just stretching out into the background with these purple mountains, majesty, and cattle in the foreground. The railroad very much wanted to bring people to California so that they would start their own orange orchards and then give their business to the railroad. The Southern Pacific, Santa Fe Railroad, even the Pacific Electric and some of the interurban car systems that came out of Los Angeles had a number of different tours where they would pile as many people as they could onto a train, take them through the orange groves and say, hey, by the way, there's land here for sale in northern Orange County or in San Diego County. We'd love to sell you some at a reasonably low rate. Or what they thought was a reasonably low rate anyway. Pamphlets and brochures were just one way to get the word out about oranges. Another more popular way to do so was to have traveling exhibits or fairs, which were immensely popular across the United States in the late 19th century. Starting from the first orange fairs, which were popular in the San Bernardino and Los Angeles County areas as early as the 1880s, people started to go from the Golden State outward. And in particular, the railroad would actually pay orange growers to pack as much fruit as they could onto the railroad cars, take it to places like the Midwest, to Iowa in particular, to run demonstration trains to different farms, showing Iowans or Kansans, here's how you can get rich growing golden apples, as they referred to oranges, out on the Pacific. World's fairs in places like Chicago were a great way to get the word about oranges as well. In 1893, to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering the New World, I wish I could get famous by getting lost, the United States celebrated what was known as the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which is really like the biggest American town on the make in the 19th century. Every state in the Union, every territory that flew the American flag, as well as a number of different countries, had some sort of exhibition at the World's Columbian Exposition. And California's included this beloved Monument of the Oranges, as it's called. This comes from an official guidebook to the World's Columbian Exposition, and it shows us a tower that's comprised entirely of citrus fruits, with an American eagle at the top, the bald eagle. The neck looks more like a stork to me, but what do I know? I'm no ornithologist. This image, photographs of the Orange Tower, text about its appearance, and the deliciousness of California oranges were published in newspapers across the country, which created an even greater market segment for citrus from the Golden State, and actually drove out a lot of competitors. Italy and Florida, for instance, who didn't have access to the railroad or its advertising money, were not able to compete, were not able to keep up with what was coming out of California. And in particular, a lot of Florida newspapers in this period would have editorials shaking their fist at Southern California for cornering the orange market in places like Boston and New York. A couple citrus fairs also took place that were very successful within Southern California. Anyone who's ever been to San Bernardino is probably familiar with the National Orange Show. Exactly, yeah, it's a beautiful place. You can still have events there. They still do bring in citrus fruits every now and then. National Orange Show was started in about 1911. These two postcards commemorate the event from over the years. My favorite one is that one on the top left. That is a railroad locomotive constructed entirely out of oranges with a coal tender full of lemons. You could see the rain cross of the Santa Fe Railroad in the window of that railway there. Orange County had its own Valencia Orange Fair, because Orange County doesn't want to get left out, right? And Orange County is where the Valencia industry is like so deeply rooted, so why should it get left out? But the images like this would have been circulated across the country very widely. As I said, these were postcards, so literally people would mail these, would say, hey, come to California. Cousins who were freezing back in Iowa or Kansas or Michigan right now, there was that whole mythology that built up about, these kids in the Midwest who would open up their stockings on Christmas Day only for an orange to tumble out. Like it was this beautiful, delicious thing kissed by the sun. Kissed by the sun. Yeah, it's not that clever, but it held. It was a hugely popular brand. The Sunkist was a cooperative citrus association that was created by orange and lemon growers in about the 1890s to market their fruits. Without getting too much into the commercial weeds of it, essentially it allowed growers to take control of their industry away from middlemen and away from auction houses on the East Coast that were undercutting their profits. The California Fruit Growers Exchange was the official name of the organization, but the Sunkist brand that appeared on a number of different advertisements, like orange crate labels, such as this one, would have been what consumers knew it by. And in fact, by the 50s, it changed its name to Sunkist Growers. Sunkist handled marketing, distribution, made sure that when the prices of oranges were starting to go down on various markets, like New York, maybe that city wouldn't get oranges for a week or so, just to make sure that prices could stabilize. We laugh, but it was, what they did back then. I don't want to say it's what they do today, but, at any rate, Sunkist was remarkably successful at advertising, at getting people to buy oranges only if they had the Sunkist label on the side or were stamped on the skin. That's the nice thing about oranges, right? You don't really eat the skin, so you can stamp stuff on there and it won't harm the actual fruit that gets consumed. The Sunkist had all kinds of all-color advertisements that would have appeared in places like Saturday Evening Post, Ladies' Home Journal, because women are the ones making grocery purchases, and pretty much still are today. They had different promotional venues where if you had proof of purchase, if you saved the tissue wrappers that were used to wrap the oranges, you kept like 10 or 20 of these, you could mail them into Sunkist, and they might send you a set of silverware or a nice goblet to drink your orange juice out of. That's another thing Sunkist did. They basically invented orange juice. They certainly made it a fixture of the American breakfast. So if you see all these Minute Maid ads about Florida oranges and orange juice, you got the idea from here. I went too far. Oh no, I did go too far. Okay. This is a map of some of the land that the railroad owned in Southern California in about the 1880s. Millions of acres across the American West, not even acres, millions of square miles across the American West were given by the government of the United States to the railroad, with the goal being that the railroad would sell this land and use that income to subsidize construction and maintenance of the railway networks. The green is what the Southern Pacific Railroad owned in Southern California. Yeah, so much of much of San Bernardino County, little chunk, it looks like it kind of goes into the Chino Hills and a little bit beyond, so maybe into Orange County, potentially, and definitely up in Santa Barbara County. The railroad not only sold this land, but in many cases it would develop it. It would lay electric power lines, it would build canals to these areas, or at least subsidize construction of canals by other companies to make sure that when farmers came in, they could pretty much start readying the earth on day one so that they could plant their own oranges and grow wealthy off them. There's another railway map. This one actually shows us the Santa Fe Railroad from Los Angeles to San Bernardino and then spiraling out from those two areas down to places like San Diego or up into the Central Valley. This map is not geographically accurate for a number of reasons. First of all, it shows the city of Lordsburg, which is called Laverne, as being east of Claremont. Second of all, have you ever spelled Santa Ana with 2 N's? I've never seen it that way. At any rate, we could see multiple rail lines sort of spreading out across the region, especially going down this coastal route, the surf line, from Los Angeles down through coastal Orange County and eventually terminating in San Diego before going down into the Pacific. This map was made by a colleague of mine at the University of Laverne, and it really shows what I think of as the extent of the octopus's garden, with some of the more important cities here. So again, we see Los Angeles, sort of the center of the map. Los Angeles has to be the center of everything. Riverside was where the Washington Naval Orange craze got its start. The Fullerton, Anaheim, Santa Ana orange growing district is really the heart of Valencia growing country here in Orange County. All the way up to the northwest here, Ventura and Santa Paula are very well known for the oranges that they're producing. The largest lemon plantation in the world is located in Santa Paula at Limonera by 1900 or so. Most citrus growing is concentrated in this belt here, from about Pasadena out to San Bernardino, Redlands area. And scholars and people who were alive at the time frequently referred to this as the Orange Belt. So they have stuff like the Orange Belt Flyer, the Orange Belt Special, trains that went specifically to this region. If this looks a lot like our freeway network today, there's a reason for that. Let's not forget that just about every segment of American society participated in the California citrus industry, and that included women to very large numbers. Women in particular were crucial to packing houses in the citrus industry. Unlike other forms of farming, citrus agriculture was very heavily mechanical in terms of the way that the fruits were processed, cleaned, shipped, distributed across the country. And in particular, different cooperatives would have what they referred to as packing houses, where all the different growers from a single town could come together, pack their fruits, and they would be paid back for what they made on the market later on. A lot of packing houses are still standing today, even if they're not packing fruits. How many folks have been to the Anaheim packing house, for instance, right? Exactly. How many folks have been to the Claremont packing house up in Claremont? A handful. If you go there and go to Gus's barbecue restaurant and give my name, they'll give you exactly 0% discount. But at any rate, the packing houses back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were heavily mechanized. They had all these mechanical fruit sorters, sizers, conveyor belts, all kinds of technical equipment that women are getting their hands on and learning how to use, which really paves the way for them to take part in World War II, to become Rosie the Riveter, where they're building battleships, building airplanes to go beat Japan. More on that in a minute. And in particular, it was not just white women who were taking part in this. A number of Latinas, particularly Mexican-American women, went to work in the packing houses to make their families dual income. This was especially true during World War II, when a lot of white women would go off to take part in the defense sector, working in battleship factories or steel mills, and Mexican-American women would come into packing houses to take over and make sure that the citrus industry was still producing enough food to feed the troops. Another aspect in which that became mechanized was the production of ice. This is a picture of the Pacific Fruit Express, which was a railway system jointly established by the Southern Pacific and Union Pacific Railways to create refrigerator cars that could service the Southern California fruit industry. For a lot of years, these companies relied on outside producers, places like Chicago packing houses and yards, to produce their refrigerator cars. So Southern Pacific creates Pacific Fruit Express partly to take control of its own supply, its own fleet of cars, so it doesn't have to lease from somebody else. They had huge icing plants in places like Colton, San Bernardino, and Los Angeles that were used for literally just making ice to make sure that the fruits didn't spoil in transit. Whoa. Spoilers, close your eyes. I know, we'll get there. This clicker has a different opinion about what speed we should operate than I do. Where's the laptop that actually, there it is, okay. That makes much more sense. Oh, there's my hometown. Man, we're getting all the spoilers right now. Yeah. Okay, so I talked about how different communities from across Southern California were pivotal to the citrus industry, but I didn't talk about the group that was arguably the most pivotal of all, and without which California would not today be the primary producer of fruits, vegetables, of produce of all kinds. And that is, of course, our immense Mexican-American population. By the 1920s, thanks to push and pull factors like the Mexican Revolution and the commercial prosperity of Southern California, a lot of people came across the border into the United States to get jobs in the citrus sector. Mexican-American labor was dominant in California's agricultural force from the 1920s until today. It remains that way. The top image shows a slide of this is a lemon packing house actually up in Ventura County. I should mention that the public showed about as much appreciation for Mexican Americans as it did for the Chinese people whom it had mistreated generations before. By 1930, for instance, when the US was going through through the Great Depression, a lot of Mexican Americans were put onto railway cars, sent across the border into what was known as the repatriation effort, saying, sorry, there's not enough jobs for the white people in America. All of you Spanish-speaking Mexican folks are going to have to go back to Mexico. And a lot of the people that they sent south of the border were actually folks who were born, raised, and lived in Southern California. So to call it repatriation is a historical travesty. Maybe these Mexican Americans sense some injustice, or some justice a few years later during World War II, when they came back to the United States as part of what was known as the Bracero program, where the US government very much targeted Mexico as a source of cheap labor to help keep the farm and railroad sectors running during World War II, because all the white men were off fighting in the Pacific or in Europe, and all the Japanese farmers that they had relied on were locked up in concentration camps. This triumphant image on the bottom here actually shows braceros coming off of a train at Union Station in Los Angeles, waiting to be told what orange groves they will be working at. Well, all good things come to an end, including, I hope, this talk. And the end really came for the citrus and railroad industries with World War II. That was when the writing started to come on the wall. A couple things happened then. First of all, Southern California became a huge factory that produced airships, tanks, war supplies, battleships that were sent directly across the Pacific to fight Japan. And so as a result, a lot of the orange and lemon groves that were here were uprooted. The trees were either destroyed or moved to the Central Valley so that housing could be built for all the millions of workers who were streaming into the state during and after the war. Also after World War II, California finally has access to enough funding to build an excellent roadway system. This is the interstate highway system as it appeared about 2000 or so. All of these freeways were built largely in the late 40s and early 50s during the early Cold War, actually as a defense measure. But if you were to overlay this with the map of the railroads, you'd see almost a 1-for-1 ratio. Why go away from the railroads when they established such successful routes? And to be perfectly fair, the railroads had actually followed, in many cases, the footpaths of indigenous peoples who lived in California before. But by the 40s, it became obvious that the Orange Empire was no longer going to be centered in Southern California, and that railway transportation was going to be replaced by trucking for commercial shipping or by just cars for moving individual people. Damn it, Bobby. Come on. There we go. Let me explain to Orange County residents what this image shows, because you can't possibly decipher what it is by yourself. 4,000 orange trees along the ball tract that Walt Disney bought in the 1950s to turn into Disneyland were torn down to make way for this magnificent park. Here's how it appeared in the mid-1950s, around the time that it opened. There's no Galaxy's Edge, there's no Space Mountain, so why would I go there? There's no Big Thunder Mountain. What a travesty. But what there is, circling this park, is a beautiful line that was originally known as the Disneyland and Santa Fe Railroad. It was actually bankrolled originally, at least partly, by the Santa Fe. That was the railroad that Walt used to get from Kansas City, Missouri, out to Southern California in the 1920s. So, although it's gone. It's no longer commercially dominant. The railroad still has one of its tentacles around the public imagination of Southern California. Go to Laverne, which is the town where I work, and you'll see images like this one. This is an old steam train on a public mural going through an orange grove with purple mountain's majesty up in the background there. You'll see that in all kinds of places. You'll see orange and railroad murals in San Gabriel Valley, San Bernardino. I remember shopping at a Trader Joe's, I want to say it was in Tustin one time, and I look up on the walls and there's this big mural going around the whole building. What's that?
There's one in Brea.
One in Brea. I haven't been to the Brea TJ's. I'll have to go there. I love Sprouts. I don't know how they have art, though. We're going to skip this in the interest of time. Another way in which citrus and railroads still sort of court the imagination of Southern California is through museums and historical parks. This is not an image of how Riverside appeared a century ago. This is about how it appeared 10 years ago, as taken from the California Citrus State Historic Park, which is about 400 acres, not a whole lot of land, but just enough to show how orange growing worked. If you go there during January, you can go during Washington Naval Orange season, and they'll give you some fruits from right off the trees. Free vitamin C. There's the interior shot showing the actual museum setting if you want a more traditional indoor approach. There's also what's known as the Southern California Railway Museum out in Riverside County, in particular in the city of Paris. I must confess I am more partial to its original name, which is the Orange Empire Railway Museum, but it has an impressive collection of rolling stock, Pullman Palace cars, Pacific Electric streetcars, steam locomotives from the Santa Fe and Southern Pacific Railways that you can actually still ride around the tracks there. Some of my favorite vestiges of this particular museum include the wonderful sun-kissed advertisement that I happened to find once when I was going into one of the railroad cars. That top image there shows cooling, healthful sun-kissed lemonade in an advertisement in one of the Pacific Electric streetcars at the museum. On the bottom, we can see one of the yellow refrigerator cars that was used by Pacific Fruit Express. This is one of the famed reefers that allowed produce from California to reach distant markets across the United States. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of our train and the end of our time together. So, if you have any thoughts, any questions, or even reminiscences of your own, I would absolutely love to hear them.
Another microphone here. So as you have questions, raise your hand. I'll go out to you with the mic, and you can. Are you going to do that? No. Okay. I'll do that.
Oh, I can project. I'm a teacher.
Okay. Let's check.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I bought my first home in Orange County on Cerritos Avenue at 9th Street, the first house I say west of Disneyland, literally, next to the railroad tracks. And it comes down from Manchester, I think. It's Southern Pacific. When I bought it in 87, curving around north of Beach Boulevard, parallel. And I recently found some maps from the 30s of the growing people that had the orchards there. But I've owned that from the second owner. They were actually a Japanese-American family that owned the home originally. But a lot of history for me personally in Anaheim with, I think that's where they packed up the fruit from them on the tracks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it because Anaheim, I didn't give it its due in this talk because you have to condense what I'm talking about here. But Anaheim was really one of the first regions in Orange County to actually grow oranges in large numbers, Valencia's in particular. It's very interesting that you noted these were Southern Pacific tracks that were running behind your house because in 1987 they absolutely would have belonged to Southern Pacific. But in 1996, I think it was, Southern Pacific got bought out by Union Pacific, its one-time rival. So the fact that you were able to live there and access those maps back when it was still Southern Pacific country is fantastic. Southern Pacific also had some difficulties coming through what is today Orange County. Did not get along with the proprietors of the Irvine Ranch, for instance. A controversy about them, who would have imagined?
Hi, this for all your Orange County one. Well, they had the labels on the boxes, and the labels on the boxes that came from Orange County would say Orange County, or it could be Orange specific, because Orange County was, just maybe people argue this one, had the best oranges anywhere. And And when they went back east with those labels on them, they sold for a premium. They were the best.
That's very true. If you look at a lot of the, well, I'm not going to agree or disagree with the best oranges. I won't cause a stir here. But if you look at a lot of the orange crate labels or lemon crate labels that appeared back in the 19th and 20th centuries, they'd say, oh, these are from Orange County. Don't settle for anywhere else. These are from Riverside. Don't settle for anywhere else. These are from San Gabriel. Don't settle for anywhere else. There was sort of like a friendly-ish competition among these different regions. Like I said, I've given talks at Riverside and Redlands recently. You would get a different reaction if you said Orange County oranges were better up in those regions. But we're also comparing oranges with different oranges, Valencias with navels as well. So again, I'm not going to step foot and venture an opinion there.
I was just wondering, have you ever thought about doing Jeopardy?
That's very kind of you to say, young sir. The only Jeopardy I've ever played was on my Nintendo Wii back in the early 2000s with my friends. I might give it a shot. My uncle auditioned once and didn't quite make it on. So if nothing else, if I make it out of Jeopardy, I could rub it in his face that I did what he couldn't. That's very kind of you to say, sir. Thank you.
Well, good news is I get to play Phil Donahue tonight, so at least we got some TV role playing here. Yes.
Yeah, Ben, I know we've met before, and thank you once again for speaking at our library, but I didn't get a chance to tell you, only because this conversation brought it. My grandparents were those individuals that came out from Nebraska and Iowa, and they came to the Brookside Winery in the process in which Prohibition had just been passed. And Prohibition actually promoted the orange growing industry because they plowed under their vineyards in Ontario where they were living. And they plotted, and what they planted instead were oranges because they couldn't make a living from their grapes anymore, from their vineyards, and that actually would not change until my dad was way into his 20s in the 1950s.
Wow.
And so actually as I said, it greatly promoted the orange industry, and a place that wasn't the intent. Those were all wine growers.
Oh yes, Ontario region has had a huge grape for wine industry for the century. So thank you for sharing that, Aura. Yeah, it's sort of sad that Prohibition killed a lot of a lot of grape plantations, because if they just waited like another 10 years, right, they would have been fine.
Yeah, they could just hold out.
Exactly, but I guess nobody knew back in the 20s. Yes, sir.
Actually, that was the worst wine anyone ever drank from Rancho Cucamonga. My father was the manager of a orange packing house in Garden Grove during the Second World War because the manager had to go to war. And so my brother and I actually put labels on the orange packing boxes, and then we stacked them in the car as well. So I was there when I was just a little boy, and we had a lot of good Hispanic people working as packers and pickers as well. Yeah,
That's
it was a
wonderful.
good time.
Thank you for sharing that with me. As a side note on World War II, I've also heard a lot of stories about POWs, particularly German POWs, being brought to California and used as free labor, essentially. I know up in Los Angeles County in Laverne, for instance, I interviewed a guy who worked alongside German POWs, and they were incredible workers. Terrible people, but incredible workers. You see a woman in the darker blue, and then we'll get to the woman in the lighter blue.
Okay. Is this the right way? I did a bunch of research for a book, but John Downey, and he was one of the early movers and shakers, as you know. And I was asking your opinion here. As I recall, there was some information that's not real well known about the bribes that were made in Southern California to get the line to go through what then became Downey. Because of the stipends that were paid to the railroad. And then John Downey made a lot of money off of that. Have you read anything about that in your research?
Yes. Was John Downey corrupt in his dealings with the railroad? Yes, I have read that.
You have read that. Okay. Just checking.
I'm not expressing an opinion, but yes, you were not. Yes.
Okay.
Let's just call it yes.
Second question, are you selling your book here? Did you bring it?
I do have a few copies, yes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think the woman in the lighter blue at the same table had her hand up just slightly before some of the others.
Oh. I used to teach. I don't need a microphone. I grew up on a citrus ranch here, and my father told me that during World War II, the spurs of the railroad were not operating, and the Valenches were ripening. They had to get them to Riverside. They had to get them. There was a big Sunkist factory in Riverside, and they had to be gotten there. So the young people in Orange County whose families owned orchards, they had to pile all of those oranges because they couldn't allow them to rot. And so they piled them into the backs of trucks and everything, and had to actually hand deliver them to Riverside in order to have them processed and everything. So I don't know if that was during when the Mexicans were being repatriated, perhaps, when there weren't enough people. But that's what they had to do because the railroads actually failed them at that point.
The railroads did fail them largely because the government came in during World War II and said, you're going to prioritize defense traffic. If we're moving tanks, if we're moving soldiers to get to different forts or training grounds on the West Coast, those trains are going to have priority over, farming in Southern California. But you're right, part of it was a labor shortage. Like by 1942 and 1943, the railroads were like going to the U.S. government hat in hand, begging them, please let us recruit Mexican workers because we don't have enough people to staff our trains. So you're right, the railroad did face some difficulties in operating its tracks to its full extent, and that also sort of planted the seed for, well, can we just use cars then after World War II? Sadly. But thank you for sharing your reminiscences.
Let's see. What side are we talking to? Either side, I guess. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay. My wife and I, about a month ago, went to Promontory Summit, Utah, to see the yearly celebration for the connecting of the railroads. And anyone who hasn't been there, gone on that trip, I highly recommend it. It's just beautiful. They reenact it every weekend. This was the 155th year of the celebration of it, but there was a very large contingency of direct descendants of the Chinese workers there, American Indians, and of course reenactors of the governor of the railroads or the state. And I sure recommend it if you haven't been there to go to Promontory Summit and see that state park. It's a national park now.
It is. It's very nice, and thank you for sharing that. I know that they do have a nice monument. I think it's an archway to Chinese workers in particular, as a way of sort of having a small apology to say, oh, we treated Chinese workers so immensely poorly, and yet they built the railroad back in the late 19th century. Before we get to the gentleman with the microphone, I think there's a woman up here who had a hand up before.
Thank you. My family's been in Anaheim for 5 generations.
Wow.
And we're mixed. Native German Dutch, Mexican American, Native American. And those families had always been here, and most of my relatives worked in the Anaheim packing house, worked in the Placentia packing house. What I found to be interesting, I know that there's a lot of political organizations that formed because the women, like all my uncles enlisted, went to World War II. There was a significant amount of Mexican American people that enlisted. And the women stayed and took care of the packing houses. And as a result, there was a lot of political activity around that too, that I'm personally aware of.
I think you're absolutely right. And there's a reason that, Orange County, the Westminster decision happens with such deep local roots, right? It's not, and there's a reason that predates the Brown versus Board of Education one. I think it's because of on-the-ground political activism by the Latino communities, particularly women who don't receive much credit, especially because there's this public perception that, Mexican American culture is machismo, right? That only the men have power, which flies in the face of everything we know about Mexican American history dating back to the beginning, essentially. So thank you for that. I think there's a gentleman in the mic, and I want to get to him first, yes, and then we'll get to you, sir.
Read the book. Excellent. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
2 quick questions.
Yes.
The orchard you mentioned in eastern Fullerton or Placentia, Alfred Beck Chapman found it. He was the one who planted that. Was that later owned by Charles Chapman? Was that his orchard, do you know?
As far as I know, there's no connection.
There's no connection, ownership anyway.
Right, yeah, not that I've found.
And two, also you mentioned rich Eastern people coming out to buy blocks of property. And my experience in Orange is that most of the properties were 10, 5 acres parcels. I'm a descendant of German and Irish that both came 50 years apart, but came to Orange in 1882 and 1927. But those were small parcels. And like I say, my experience is that most of them were small. I don't know if there were big blocks being bought out in Riverside and San Bernardino County by wealthy people that bought up a lot of blocks out there, or is that the case?
Generally, no. The rule of the day was that if you had like a 5 to 10 acre grove, you could support your family pretty comfortably.
Sure.
And if you had one that was larger than that, you could build a much larger house on that property and have something larger. So honestly, 5 to 10 acres was the norm in places like San Gabriel Valley or San Bernardino Valley. These aren't like enormous plantations that we might see in the antebellum South, or even the enormous farms that we would have seen up in the Central Valley in California. It really was very small scale, as you're indicating, operated directly by the family in many cases. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll get to you, sir, I promise.
We'll try to get to everybody.
I know, I understand. You're doing a great job.
I wonder if you could comment on Mission Pack, which was a huge, huge industry in California, moving oranges and lemons and avocados from the west to the east, and I presume by railroad. And then it was like Blockbuster. You know, Blockbuster came up and had its little place, and boom, it's gone. And I think that's exactly what happened with Mission Pack as well.
Yeah, from everything I've read about Mission Pack, which admittedly isn't as much as it could be, it seems like more of a flash in the pan, because usually the citrus industry preferred its own internal distributors, which were Sunkist or Mutual Orange Distributors, which is a smaller operation based sort of in the western San Bernardino Valley.
Yeah, I think the people that came in the 30s and 40s used Mission Pack to send fruit to the families at East for Christmas.
That makes good sense. It's also around the time that oranges would have moved out of Southern California a little bit farther north into what we think of as the Central Valley today. So Mission Pack, admittedly not something I'm an expert in. All right, I think, Tom, you've waited long enough.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the Orange County citrus quarantine that's going on right now, because surprisingly a lot of people aren't aware of it.
Right.
I live in a 1910 farmhouse in Anaheim that was part of a 10-acre orange grove at one time. It's now a third of an acre, and we had 3 citrus trees, Valencia, Navel, and a Meyer lemon that was inspected by the state agricultural agency about a year or so ago, tagged, took some samples. They came back just recently and again took samples of the leaves and of the roots, bagged it up, sent it off to a lab. They came back a few weeks later saying that all 3 trees had to be removed because they had an incurable disease. I think it's HCP, if I'm not mistaken.
HCP?
It's Asian...
HLB?
HLB.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it affects all citrus trees and incurable, and they want to remove any infected trees before it spreads to a healthy tree. So unfortunately, we lost all our citrus trees, all of which were there when we bought the house in 1989. So, and they were already mature trees at that time. So it's kind of sad. I understand you can't even buy a citrus tree in Orange County right now because of it. And they dug up the trees and said it would be at least a year before we could plant another citrus tree in that in that area. So, yeah, it's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate, and I'm sorry to hear that. It's not the first time that citrus has been blighted by something, whether it's the Cottony-Cushion scale in the 1880s or tristeza, the so-called quick decline that established in the 1940s. Eventually, they found solutions to those problems. So my best hope is that the University of California, the experiment stations that are operated by the state will be able to find some sort of way of treating the disease at some point. But for the time being, the outlook in places like Orange County is unfortunately bleak. And on that note...
On that note...
Oh, no.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. It was my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
There is so much to say about citrus.
Oh, yes, definitely. It's a popular topic.
Thank you. Yeah, there is so much to say about citrus and the railroads. I mean, we could have you back another 10 times, and
And still, I'd have more to say.
and there'd still be more to say for sure. Well, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I do want to mention that Dr. Jenkins has some books for sale. So if you want to set up maybe at the same table over there where we're doing our election results,
I'd be happy to. Thank you.
I think you'll sell out pretty fast.
It wouldn't surprise me, yeah.
And I also want to say, if you've still got your ballot and haven't put it in the ballot box, please do. Alan's taking them over there. And we will tally those up later and report that at a later time. And again, if you have not helped yourself, if you're a member of the society and would like free books, we still have some in the back. I think there's a few more goodies on the goodie table, cookies and lemonade and whatnot. Thank you all for coming tonight, and we will see you in September.
I was in such a rush to get here. I had